Hi, welcome to session 3 of the last topic of the semester, the ninth topic of the semester, the countercultural revolution and the civil rights movement from 1950 to 1973. Now, this is the last session. This is session 3, and in this session, we're going to devote our attention to cover the civil rights movement, okay, of the 1960s. So we already covered quite extensively the baby boomer generation, the background, again, of this particular generation in the first and second sessions as to why this particular generation is going to be so influential in bringing about reform in the United States, political reform particularly, but also cultural change. You know, we talked about the cultural, the countercultural revolution, particularly in the second session. And so here we're going to just look at the civil rights movement, again, that the baby boomer generation is going to launch. Again, this is really the last popular reform movement of the United States, again, that we're going to see not only in this class, but again, this is as far as we have seen as a widespread popular movement that in U.S. history that actually push for change in the political system or in the economic system or social change as well. Of course, this is something that in U.S. history, this has happened, of course, quite extensively, reform movements, etc. But again, this is the last one. The 1960s civil rights movement was actually the last reform movement in U.S. history, and this is the one that we are going to actually cover here quite extensively in this very last session. This is the last session of the semester, by the way. All right, so if we go to our slide, okay, let me just put the slide here. So again, this is part 2, looking at the civil rights movement from the 1950s to the 1960s, thereabouts. And what we're going to do is look at the civil rights movement by first paying attention to the historical background, the historical roots of the civil rights movement. Okay, and then once we do that, then we can actually now go into the movement itself that started about 1954, 1955, and which particular groups were, organizing and were trying to effect change in the United States. We're going to see exactly what kind of change, what was the petition, what was the circumstance, again, that led a wide variety of different groups in the United States to organize, to become very active and trying to pretty much, again, enact change in the political system, particularly. And at the end, we're going to look at legislation. What pieces of legislation were introduced, the civil rights legislation, that is to say, that intended to address some of the concerns, the needs, again, of certain groups, again, within the society that lacked, in this case, opportunities or equal pay or representation in the political system or political participation. Period. Again, so all of those issues we're going to address here in this very last session. Okay, so let us pay attention first and foremost to the historical roots of the civil rights movement. Okay, so let us first pay attention to the historical roots. So I mentioned again that the civil rights movement was the last popular reform movement in U.S. history. And when we look back, at the United States, ever since the formation of the United States in 1787, the American Republic, we have seen specific time, periods of time in which, there was intense activity by the citizenry. Citizens were, organizing. They were, forming organizations or clubs or even political parties, because during those times, people felt that the society needed reform. That there were ills, in the cities, or the political system did not create enough room or space for people to participate, etc. So again, there were specific moments in U.S. history that we're going to see that people are becoming highly organized and politicized in trying to bring about change. And those are the greatest popular reform movements in U.S. history, of which the civil rights movement is the last one, by the way. For example, when you just look back again, just looking at a very comprehensive view of U.S. history, we have seen, for example, that in the 1830s, we're going to see the first popular reform movement that was actually called the Second Great Awakening. Okay, Second Great Awakening. It was also called the social gospel as well, the social gospel. So if you take 1301, you'll see that there was intense, activity taking place in terms of religious organizations trying to, address the problem of alcoholism in the cities, poverty, the lack of education, illiteracy, and so on. And the issue of slavery was also, again, addressed during the Second Great Awakening. And it lasted for about 15 years, this reform period. And then, of course, the second reform period in U.S. history was Reconstruction, just immediately after the U.S. Civil War. Again, the process of Reconstruction that followed the Civil War really was a process that not only rebuilt the country physically, materially, but also legally, in terms of abolishing slavery, okay, emancipating 4 million slaves, and giving them citizenship as well. There was a constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment, that granted citizenship to the freed population. So the 13th Amendment was the abolition of slavery. The 13th and the 14th granting citizenship to the freed population. And the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction, again, granted the right to vote to all males, regardless of race and color as well. Okay, so this was considered to be a second reform era, if you will, because, the country was reformed in a very dramatic way, from the way the country existed in the past, in the period of Reconstruction, really rebuilt the United States in a whole new fashion. Then, in this class, particularly, we covered, of course, populism, progressivism, okay, from the 1880s all the way to 1920, in about 40-year period. Again, there were farmers, there were the industrial working class, the middle class that really wanted to improve the modern industrial system, and even the political system that was evolving again in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So we covered that quite extensively. Again, they wanted to improve conditions for farmers, the conditions for workers in the factories, and so on, creating reforms to improve their lives, and so on. And of course, the cities, the industrial cities, were also totally revamped, totally reformed, well managed, well administered, and so on, during that era. This is an intense period of reform, by the way. And then another period of reform was the New Deal. Okay, the New Deal of the 1930s also brought about significant change in the economic order. Okay, so we cover that quite thoroughly. Particularly, the New Deal introduced the welfare systems, the Social Security, for example, okay, in which the state is now involved in providing the citizenry with, safety nets, social safety nets, particular assistance to the people that are unemployed, pensions for people that retire after 65, providing assistance to single mothers and orphans and so on. So people who have no means of sustaining themselves, for example, again, the state is now, providing some form of sustenance. That's what the great contribution of the New Deal, okay, that we covered. And so those are the great reform movements, again, in U.S. history so far. And the last one is the one that we're going to see here, is the Civil Rights Movement. This is the last popular reform movement in U.S. history. And this is a movement that spanned between the 1950s and 60s, although the last piece of legislation that is considered to be a civil rights issue, again, was introduced about 1972, 1973. So we can say early 70s, okay? So, but the most intense decades, again, of the civil rights movement was the 50s and 60s, without a doubt. Okay, so now let's get into the background, as to, okay, so what is the civil rights movement? How can we really understand it? Okay, so for example, when we covered populism and the progressivism, we looked at specific groups, again, of people like farmers, industrial workers, for example, and the middle class. And we looked at those groups, particularly what kind of problems they faced during that time, the challenges or problems or obstacles, and what they believed were the solutions to those problems, the reforms, in other words, that they were pushing for. So it's also very essential here in the civil rights movement to similarly do the same exercise here in terms of identifying the groups. Okay, so which particular groups are going to be fundamental in carrying out this activism, okay, this reform movement. And so here, in the 50s and 60s, the groups that will become more active, okay, in society and trying to push for change and reform were minorities, okay, minorities. And when we mean minorities, it's not necessarily a numerical issue, okay, although it can be, interpreted as a numerical issue that some groups, particularly, for example, ethnic groups in the United States, were considered, less in number than others, for example. So therefore, there were minorities. But that was not the case for all of the groups because, for example, women, okay, they were also considered minorities, but they were not necessarily less than men. As a matter of fact, there's more women, statistically than men, of course. So they're not really less than men. But, the implication here, in using the term minority is that it implies that those are groups of people that do not really have the same access, if you will, to political power. Okay, they don't have the same access to participate even in the political process, like voting, for example. There's a lot of restrictions, limitations, and so on that hinder their ability to participate. So that's it. Again, this is what it means. Again, so minorities also indicate that the certain groups of people do not have the same access to, let's say, resources. Okay, for example, education. Okay, they might not have the same quality of education that the dominant groups, for example. Sorry. Or they don't have access to the same wages, to the same jobs, and so on. So that's what the implication, again, of the term minority is. It's not just necessarily that they're numerically, less than other groups, even though that's the case here, but it's also that they just do not have an equal representation in the system, whether it's in the political system or in the economic system. They're not equally represented. They don't have equal access to resources, equal access to jobs, education, or equal access to political office, for example, holding office or voting. Okay? And so the civil rights movement was a movement of minorities, okay, in this case. So this is very important because when you look back, for example, populism and progressivism, that we covered, the groups that were very active during the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s, those were actually economic groups, okay? Occupational, if you will, like farmers, for example. That's an occupational group. That's an economic group, for example. The industrial working class is likewise like an occupational group as well. The middle class is sort of classes, if you will. But here, in the 1950s and 60s, the groups that were most active in society in trying to bring about change were actually minorities. Okay, so let's go through the main groups, that are going to become very active in this movement, and it's just understand the background. In other words, okay, so which were those minorities? Let's identify them and look at some of the background, some of the issues that they faced in the United States at this time that pushed them for actually trying to create change, so they could also have equal opportunity, equal access, if you will, again, to resources and political power as well. All right, so we start with women, okay? And so the reason we start with women is because this is a so-called minority, even though numerically it's not a minority, that has been, enduring significant challenges, and we can say also subjugation and oppression for a long, long time, for thousands and thousands of years, by the way, okay, for at least 5,000 years. And we say that is because when we study world history, okay, just by looking at world history, once upon a time, before women became subjugated, okay, by men, of course, by males, by a male-dominated society. Before that actually occurred, about 5,000 years ago, before that time, actually women were dominant, as a matter of fact. Okay, once upon a time, in an age called the Bronze Age, okay, that spanned, roughly speaking, about 8,500 BC, all the way to 3,500 BC. So about 5,000 year period. It's called the Bronze Age. Okay, women were dominant. Women were dominant in the society. Again, women were the heads of the household. They were the heads of society. They were the rulers of society. Again, this is what is called matriarchy. Okay, a matriarchy is women's rule or women power. Again, in which women were the head of the household. They were the head of the family. They were the village chiefs, if you will. Those were the females as well. They were the important, leaders, elders, making all of the decisions for the society, as a matter of fact. So once upon a time, during the Bronze Age, again, it was the women that were actually dominant. Okay? So again, roughly, 8,000 to 3,000 BC, the Bronze Age. So it is really around 3,000 BC that we're going to see now a shift, in which now the male is becoming more and more dominant. Okay? So it's very intricate, the explanation for that, but it is really the discovery of iron, beginning the Iron Age, about 3,000 BC, okay, that started now a new trend in world history, in which the male, because it's the one that is dominating iron, and it is using iron in order to plow the land, for agricultural production and so on. That's male work, if you will. And because males are becoming now the providers of food, because they're the ones in charge of agriculture with the plow that is made from iron, and because the iron is also used for weapons as well. So we now initiate, the new era of warfare as well. And that's also done by males, by the way, the age of conquest. Okay, so the male becomes dominant. okay, becomes dominant at the household, becomes dominant in the economy, becomes dominant in the political system as well, the rise of kings and so on, kingdoms and so on, again, across the face of the earth, by the way. Okay, and those are kings, and those are males, patriarchy. It's called patriarchy, the rule by the father. That's what patriarchy means, whereas matriarchy is ruled by the mother, by the way, ruled by the mother. So patriarchy is ruled by the father, okay? And this is something that started out, again, about 3000 BC. And again, ever since that time, women, became pretty much subordinated to men. In every aspect of life, as a matter of fact, they were the private property, the private possession of the male. If you were born into a family, as a female, you were the private property of your father, for example, okay? And the father could actually marry you to another male, for business purposes or for, private interests and so on, commercial transactions and so on. That became the norm, by the way. And also women couldn't actually own property, as a matter of fact. Okay, so again, so this started out, for thousands of years, a tradition in which females couldn't actually own land. They couldn't own property. It was actually just the male that was actually the one that was actually, allowed to own property. And in Europe, for example, if we just look at Europe or in colonial America, there was a tradition called primogeniture in entail, in which it was the oldest or eldest male that actually inherited all of the property of the father. Okay, it's called primogeniture in entail. Okay, so it was just the oldest son, in other words, that will inherit all this little kingdom, if you will. Okay, even if it was a small piece of property, like a farm, okay, that was considered to be a kingdom for the owner, again, for the father figure. Okay, and so that farmer, that father figure, will inherit that property to the eldest son. It's called primogeniture in entail. So that left out, of course, all the daughters, all the siblings, and so on and so forth. They had to become subordinated then to the male heir that will inherit the property after the father's death, in other words. So, and the daughters, of course, or the siblings in this case, it could be bought and sold, or they could be married into other families and so on. If that individual, now the new owner, the eldest son, deemed proper and convenient, again, for the family business, and that is to say. Okay, so females were simply used as property or assets for commercial purposes, for commercial transactions, that is to say. The idea of arranged marriages was the norm, all over the world, in which females had no say as to who they wanted to get married with. They just got, they were just, they were married into, other families that were well-to-do, and that was convenient for the family that was actually just arranging the marriage. That, look, we need to actually, blend or merge our interests with this other family. So we need to get you married with this individual. Might be very old and so on, but that was actually done, in the past, arranged marriages. Okay. So of course, for thousands and thousands of years, women have endured, of course, subordination in that fashion, in that they were totally dependent, subordinated to males. And of course, this practice was abolished in the 19th century in the United States. Primogeniture in entail was abolished in several states, in which by the 19th century, women were allowed to own property or inherit property, for that matter. Okay, by the 19th century. So there's significant change taking place in the 19th century in terms of, women beginning to, own property. And another moment, again, of great liberation or emancipation for women was the Industrial Revolution. Okay, the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution, in the United States of the 1820s, and 30s, and the second industrial revolution that we covered in this class and in the late 19th century. Those were very important stepping stones for the liberation of women, because they're now allowed to go out and seek a job. There are many cases, textile factories, clothing manufacturers hire women. In the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, 80% of the workforce in the United States were women, by the way. So now they're becoming more and more economically independent. They're not relying on men anymore, because now they're being hired in industries, they're earning wages, and they're becoming more and more economically independent. And with that, of course, comes many things. Women becoming economically independent means that they're going to make choices for themselves, who they want to get married with, if they want to stay in a marriage, or if they want to seek education, for example. Many women are going to follow that path, by the way. They're going to educate themselves, okay? And with education, women are going to start now really pondering very seriously about the world that they live in. And they're going to become very much engaged in significant reform movements in the United States that actually brought radical change, okay, in American society. Women, for example, were actually the force behind the abolition of slavery. Okay, the abolitionist movement, again, that started out in the 1830s and 40s in the United States, the bulk, again, about 70% of the abolitionists were women, by the way. Okay, child labor as well. This is another issue that women insisted that needed to be changed, needed to be abolished. Child labor practices in the U.S., in the United States, and of course, the right to vote. Women's suffrage. There's also a great effort by women to push for this change in terms of trying to be given the right to participate in the political process. They want to be given a voice, in other words. They want to vote. They want political representation. It's called women's suffrage, the women's right to vote as well. So this is, again, something that the Industrial Revolution indirectly caused, because that at first allowed women to become economically self-reliant. And with that, women used that opportunity, that economic liberty, to educate themselves. And as they become more and more educated, they're going to become more politically active, that is to say, in causes that really matter, in society, like slavery, child labor, and so on. Okay. And finally, of course, in 1920, women finally got the right to vote in the United States. Okay. So by 1920, women are already voting in the United States. Okay. Now, of course, this does not mean that all the problems that women face were once and for all solved, because they have been granted the right to vote by 1920. There's still significant inequality taking place, in the lives of women in the United States, and of course, and around the world. There's no doubt about that. Of course, they're still not necessarily. They don't constitute a significant presence, for example, in the workforce. Not until World War I and World War II comes along. So it is really, again, World War I and World War II that is going to push many women into the workforce, because millions of Americans, again, males in this case, they volunteered to sign up for the armed forces, and they left to fight, in those two wars by the millions. So, of course, there was a lot of vacancies. There was a lot of jobs that were left by millions of men that left their work in industries and so on. and women came in to fill in the gap, so to speak. So World War I and World War II were just another moment in which women are going to also acquire, a significant presence, okay, in the workforce, at least in the workforce. And they're there, of course, they're by the millions. They're moving now into industries, manufacturing, and so on. They were greatly needed again during those times of great national crisis and mobilization. And women participated very effectively again in trying to do the work that men were doing in the past, but now that they have to go fight the war, and now women are actually doing that work. But still, even when we look at the end of World War II in 1945, there's still the issue that women face, and that is the issue of equal economic opportunity. In other words, yes, that's true. They're being given the right to vote. They're becoming more economically independent. They can now own property and so on. And they have entered the workforce. But, women are not necessarily paid the same wage, as males are paid for doing the same task, for doing the same job. They earn less than men, okay, as a general rule in the U.S. So that's an issue. And of course, how much women can actually move in the ladder, if you will, in the economic ladder within industries, for example, the highest paying jobs, for example, the executive positions and so on. They're still, dominated by males at this time. So again, it's still, the economy is largely in the hands of males. We can say that, okay, at this time. And so women in the United States feel that they are indeed a minority, even though numerically they're not, because they do not have the same opportunities, the same access, again, to the resources, if you will, okay, of the country in terms of jobs, in terms of wages, in terms of the quality, if you will, of work and so on. That the best jobs, the best paying jobs and so on, the highest wages are still in the hands of males, in other words. Okay, so what they want is equal economic opportunity. Okay, so that's, again, the background of the first minority group that is going to be very important in the civil rights movement. Okay, so the second minority group is, again, it's Mexican Americans. Okay, Mexican Americans are we can say is a population that inhabits, for the most part, in the United States, historically speaking, what is called the American Southwest. Okay, so those are, it's a population that claims links or background going back to Spanish or Mexican heritage, if you will. Okay, going back to Mexico, those are people that actually either moved very early on when the Spaniards were colonizing the Southwest, the Spanish colonizers, when they established a series of colonies in the Southwest, or those were peoples that came from Mexico after Mexico gained independence from Spain. And those were people that actually moved into this region from Mexico, from different parts of Mexico, by the way. And they lived, again, across this region from, let's say, from Texas all the way to California. Again, this is roughly speaking, the American Southwest. So they were at one point, part of Spain, they were part of the Spanish Empire. But then later we see that they were part of Mexico, if you will. Okay. So again, those are people that claim links, if you will, to a Spanish or Mexican heritage or background historically, if you will. Okay. All of the people that, have lived in the American Southwest. Now in 1848, this region becomes now part of the U.S. All of this region, again, Mexico loses the American South, what we call the American Southwest during this time. It was actually called the Mexican Northern Frontier, by the way, in the past. But this Mexican Northern Frontier from Texas to California is lost, in 1848, under the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo. Of course, there was a conflict, a war between Mexico and the U.S., and Mexico ends up losing all of this territory, of course. So this territory now becomes part of, the United States, the American Southwest. Okay, so again, there were about, at that time in 1848, about 100,000 people living in this region that are now considered to be Mexican Americans. They're no longer Mexicans anymore because they're not, living in Mexico anymore. But now, because they live in the U.S., they have now become Mexican Americans. Okay, under the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo, there were about 100,000, people that inhabited this region that now acquire a whole new political status. Okay, they're now part of the U.S., so they're now called Mexican Americans. Okay, so now we mentioned there was only 100,000 in 1848, but there will be more coming. Particularly when we look at 1870 to 1920, this is going to be the very first mass Mexican immigration wave, if you will. Okay, there has always been people crossing over, if you will, into the United States, into places like Texas, California, New Mexico, but those were, minor, if you will, crossings. But it's really not until we get to 1870, from 1870 to 1920, that we've seen massive movement again of people, moving from Mexico into the United States, about 3 million. Okay, 3 million. And something we already covered. Again, we were looking at, the earliest topics, of course. There was a lot of industries, enterprises, agricultural enterprises, ranching, mining, and so on. That a lot of Mexicans were crossing over to work, of course, search for work. Okay, agriculture, mining, ranching, for the most part. Okay, so we cover that again early in the semester. Now, another immigration wave, okay, in more and more people from Mexico coming into the U.S. to become part of this Mexican American population, came during the 40s and 50s under the Bracero program. Okay, so the Bracero program, what is the Bracero program? Well, it was really a treaty between the U.S. and Mexico in which Mexico was going to, bring in hundreds of thousands of agricultural workers to the United States to grow food, because once again, during World War II, millions of American farmers left their farms in order to go and fight the war in Europe or in Asia. So many farms were vacant and empty. So there was a food crisis, if you will, that needed to be resolved. And so the way to resolve that food crisis was to allow, Mexican immigration, if you will, okay, into the United States. It's called the Bracero program, okay, in which the United States accepted hundreds of thousands. Eventually, there will be millions, by the way, okay, of Mexicans that came over in order to grow food, crops, vegetables, citruses, and so on. Again, grains of various kinds, cotton, including cotton as well, okay. And to sustain the war effort, to sustain the American economy. So there's a great contribution there as well, okay, in terms of what this population is actually doing to sustain, of course, the American economic and political system. That is to say, to make it work, to make it function. Well, again, this population has been engaged in work such as mining, for example, ranching, agriculture, production, and so on. So that has been, of course, extremely fundamental for the development, for the economic development of the United States, particularly in times of crises like World War II. So the issue here with the Mexican American population is the issue of segregation. And that is that they were, for the most part, across the Southwest, segregated to live, if you will, outside of the mainstream, if you will, or, mainstream American society. So Mexicans had to form their own little neighborhoods called barrios. Again, let me just write it here. Barrios and colonias. Barrios and colonias are like little neighborhoods, if you will, in which, particularly in colonias, a colonia is really a neighborhood in which all of the people that live in a colonia come from the same part of town back in Mexico. Okay, so those are the immigrant groups that came from a particular city or town in Mexico, so they all know each other, and they're pretty much recreating all their culture there in the colonia. And barrio is just a neighborhood, if you will, okay, a part of town in which the Mexicans live, if you will. They don't necessarily share any historical, heritage or bonds, but they congregate there because they're segregated, and they have separate schools, separate facilities, separate accommodations, on their own, and so they're not fully integrated, okay, into American society. They don't receive the same type of education and so on, that mainstream Americans receive. And so therefore, they're kind of limited to just work in specific areas of the economy, like ranching, agriculture, and mining. It's almost like that's as far as they can go, in terms of, the opportunities that the society presents to them for moving upward. All right, so that is the issue again, segregation. Now, the third group is African Americans. African Americans, I, I placed African Americans now third because now it's going to be very easy to connect it now with the civil rights movement. That is going to begin around 1954, 1955, the civil rights movement in the 1950s, particularly because of the African Americans that are going to pretty much initiate the civil rights movement. So again, it will be easier to kind of connect and bridge, okay, looking at the background of the African Americans and how this is going to lead to now the activism, okay, of the 1950s. All right, so let's look at, of course, African Americans is very well understood, the background, that is to say, because the legacy, okay, the legacy that African Americans in the United States go back to the legacy of slavery, okay. This is something that again was introduced as early as the 1600s. By the British, okay, when they established Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia, they decided to use those colonies for agricultural production, cash crop agriculture, growing things like tobacco and rice and so on there. And they were also growing sugar, the British in Jamaica, in the Caribbean. And so what they did is they introduced slavery, African slavery, in their plantation colonies, plantation colonies in which they were producing cash crops for export. They were exporting products around the world that were highly valuable through the use of slave labor. Okay. So it all started there, again, back in the 1600s, the legacy of slavery, the introduction of African slaves in the British colonies that I just mentioned. But it's not until the 1700s that slavery is going to play a significant role in the development of both the English economy and also in the development of the American economy as well. Because what actually happened again in the 17 and 1800s was that England started the Industrial Revolution. Okay, we cover that, in this class. The Industrial Revolution. They were the forerunners of the Industrial Revolution, textile manufacturing, something that was adopted in the United States in the early 1800s as well, when the United States industrialized as well. Textile manufacturing, textiles, clothing manufacturing. And so what was actually required to manufacture the clothing was cotton, of course. Okay. And so cotton is going to acquire a great significance for the development of industries. Without cotton, it will be very difficult, not impossible, by the way, but it will just be very, very difficult for industries to develop. Okay, because they were based on clothing manufacturing. So what the British did is that they introduced in the plantations, first in their colonies that they still had in the 1700s in North America, they introduced cotton, to grow cotton, to export the cotton to England, for those industries. Of course, as the British colonies gained independence, and those colonies became the United States. And when the United States industrialized in the early 1800s, they're going to likewise use the southern states, the South, okay, in order to produce the cotton for their own industrial revolution. And cotton is going to be fundamental for the success of the rise, not only of the industrial revolution, but the rise of capitalism, as a matter of fact, cotton. Because with the industrial revolution came capitalism, by the way, okay? The industrial revolution introduced also capitalism as well, a capitalist economy. And so who was actually growing the cotton in this case, okay? Slaves, okay? So the slaves were providing the crop, the resource, the raw material, if you will, that was so fundamental for the rise of a new system altogether. That is going to launch certain nations like Great Britain and the United States to prominence, to economic, prominence, with the rise of capitalism and industries and so on. So, of course, they played a key role, okay, African Americans, in the development of the United States and also the British economy as well, all right, with cotton agriculture. And so this is extremely, extremely important, again, to understand. Now, another very significant, issue here is that in the United States, particularly, again, there will be individuals who were, in many cases, born and raised as slaves that ran away. They escaped, again, the plantation, and they moved up north into the upper states in which slavery was already abolished. And they became great voices, if you will, okay, great spokespersons for a movement to emancipate slaves, not only in the United States, but around the world, okay? The famous black abolitionists, okay? Those were the most brilliant minds, if you will, okay? That were the ones that were informing the public, that were raising awareness, okay, in the population in the United States and worldwide as to what slaves were actually going through, the lives of the slaves, the trials, the challenges, and so on, the tribulations, and so on. People like David Walker, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth, for example. They were great speakers and writers, and through their works, of course, they pretty much were able to raise awareness, consciousness, human consciousness as to the significance, of slavery, not only for the economic order, but also for the toll that it took on people's lives as well. The immense exploitation that was involved in the institution itself, of course. So again, that really pushed for a widespread movement in the United States to abolish slavery. Okay, across the North, many people were convinced that this was essential. It was essential to abolish slavery in the Constitution, to abolish slavery in the United States overall, everywhere, in all the states and the territories, everywhere, etc. Okay, so that brought about, of course, the Civil War. The Civil War was a great moment, again, in which there were forces that wanted reform, wanted change, and forces that did not want the change. Of course, the North wanted change. They wanted to, the northern states wanted to abolish slavery, and the southern states, the slave states, did not. And so that produced the Civil War, of course. And with the ultimate defeat of the slave states came the Reconstruction Amendments that I discussed in the beginning, again, of this presentation. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery, okay, that it was the Reconstruction Amendment. In other words, after the South was defeated, one of the first amendments to the U.S. Constitution was, look, we're going to declare once and for all slavery to be illegal, abolished in the United States. And so for about 4 million African slaves were liberated, okay, emancipated. Even though it did not happen instantaneously, it took some time to do so. But nonetheless, again, it was now an illegal practice. And the 14th Amendment, this is very important, it's another Reconstruction Amendment. This Reconstruction Amendment granted citizenship, again, to the free population. Again, it was not just enough to free the slaves. You also have to integrate now the freed population into the national life as well, so they can become citizens. In other words, so again, as the 14th Amendment says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deny, that is very important, to any person within its jurisdiction the equal, and that's pretty much my capitals here, and I underline equal protection of the law. In other words, if you're born in the United States, in any of the states, you're therefore a citizen, regardless of race and color and background. You're a citizen. And you, as a citizen, you enjoy all the privileges and so on, rights and liberties of the U.S. Constitution. And no one, no state, no entity can limit, okay, your rights, your liberties. You're supposed to be treated equal, in other words, under the law. Equal, in other words. Now, all citizens, by virtue of just being citizens, they should be treated equally before the law. Again, so this is going to be important as we move forward. Again, in just a moment, the 14th Amendment is going to become very, very significant here. And then the 15th Amendment introduced the right to vote. Okay, the right to vote to the free population. Okay? In this case, males. All males, are given the right to vote regardless of race and color. The 15th Amendment is the right to vote. So what we have here is that Reconstruction, the process of Reconstruction that followed immediately after the Civil War, actually was a moment of great experimentation, because here, the winning side, the Union, in this case, the radical Republicans, as they were called, Lincoln's party, okay, they really wanted to recreate American society as a multiracial democracy, they said. Okay, this is the purpose of rebuilding the United States from the ashes of the Civil War, is that there's an opportunity to build now a new type of democratic society. It's a multiracial society. It was called interracial, the same thing, multiracial democracy. Democracy for all, in other words, that everybody will have equal opportunities, again, to vote, to be educated, to own land, and so on, to hold political office. Okay, so during this process of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, this experimental period, when it was now possible to build this multiracial democracy, the federal government was actually the one protecting African Americans. Okay, they were the ones protecting African Americans, from the former masters again, from the plantation owners that wanted to retaliate against now the African Americans because they lost their slaves. They were defeated in the Civil War. They lost their slaves, and so the federal government had to move into the South and protect African Americans physically, again, from harm, from retribution, from vengeance, and so on. And so they were protected, again, by the federal government. However, what we see here is that after Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877, after Reconstruction, now the federal government transferred the responsibility of protecting the civil rights and civil liberties of African Americans now to the states, in other words, okay? The states. In other words, look, it is too much to handle to be protecting people everywhere and so on in their civil rights and so on, so they can vote and so on. Again, so now the states will have to do that, okay? The states have now the responsibility, okay, to provide civil rights, to protect the civil rights, of in this case, the African American population. Okay, but in the South, of course, the southern states that were defeated by the Civil War, they're not going to necessarily provide civil rights to the African American population. They're going to try to, by all means, to circumvent, to go around, okay, providing those civil rights, like the right to vote, for example. Okay, they're going to introduce state laws that are going to make it harder, not prohibit the right to vote, but they're going to make it hard for the African Americans, and of course the Mexican Americans as well in the Southwest, that they could vote. They're not prohibiting, voting. It's just that there's now state laws they call black codes, okay, black codes, that made it very, very hard, again, for minorities like African Americans and Mexican Americans to vote, okay, such as, for example, okay, a poll tax, $1.75. You need to pay $1.75 in order to vote. There was that amount of money was about a whole week of earnings. Again, perhaps a regular worker back then was earning about $1.75, maybe $2 a week. So are you going to spend that money, just to vote, or you're going to keep that money to, provide food, etc., anything that you need, of course. So if you're poor, or you're economically deprived, you're not going to vote. In other words, okay, that's a state law. It's a poll tax. Okay, there's a literacy test. You need to pass a literacy test. If you know how to read and write, you can vote. Well, at this time, still, the vast majority, again, of African Americans are not still literate. Okay, so they cannot read and write, so they cannot actually participate in voting or even holding office. Or the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause says if your grandfather voted, you can vote. So of course, they will say, well, my grandfather, 2 generations back, was actually, a slave. Of course, he couldn't vote. Well, that's it's a state law. It's called the grandfather clause. They prohibited pretty much people, from voting, of course. So the reality is that, in the South, African Americans do not have access, to political office. They're not given voice politically because they cannot participate in voting, okay, because of the black codes I just mentioned, okay. So this is, again, part of the issue that they face. And another issue is segregation, okay. Segregation, just like Mexican Americans are segregated in barrios and colonias, African Americans in the Deep South are also segregated as well. Again, they're called Jim Crow laws. There was a series of laws introduced by the southern states. Those are state laws, by the way. They're not federal. They're state. There's state laws that are called Jim Crow laws, just like the state laws that introduced, that we just mentioned, like the poll tax, the literacy test, the grandfather clause, that made it harder for African Americans to vote. That those laws were called black codes. Okay, the black codes. Well, the laws that segregated, okay, African Americans from the mainstream American society were called Jim Crow laws, segregation. That is to say, to segregate, to separate them. Okay, so this issue of segregation, of course, that's not something that was well accepted by everyone, of course, in the South, because there were people that had mixed backgrounds, for example. Okay, there were people that were half, white, half black, for example. Okay, so what is your identity in that case? So if you're going to be segregated, so in which side, if you will, of the aisle are you going to be in? If there's going to be a train that is going to be segregated, okay, or a public facility, well, if you're mixed background, if you identify yourself as both white and black, so where are you supposed to be? So, of course, not everybody accepted or even understood the concept of segregation. And this is something that actually ended up in the Supreme Court. And some people are going to actually challenge, segregation, particularly in the state of Louisiana. Jim Crow laws are going to be challenged by people that had mixed backgrounds, okay? Like Homer Plessy, for example, okay? Homer Plessy in Louisiana is going to board a train that was segregated. They got seats for whites, seats for blacks, and he sat on the seat for whites. He was told to move to the other side because from the perspective of the train operator, he looked pretty much, African American, but he was not. He was actually mixed. So he refused to obey the train operator, and he was refused, actually service because he was not abiding by state laws, segregation. That is to say, okay, so he sued, of course, the company, the railroad company, the owner, of course, Mr. Ferguson, and this issue got all the way to the Supreme Court in 1896. So the Supreme Court had to decide who was right and who was wrong. Okay, so what Mr. Plessy is saying is that segregation is a violation of the Constitution, he said. It's really going against the 14th Amendment. You're not treating me equally, okay? And the 14th Amendment says that all people born in the United States, just by virtue of being born in the United States, should be given equal protection of the law, equal rights, equal opportunities, in other words. Okay, and here we have a state, the state of Louisiana, and this rail company that is limiting my equal rights, in other words. Okay, so this is unconstitutional. That is his argument. It's against the Constitution. But the Supreme Court reads the argument and says, no. As a matter of fact, segregation is totally constitutional. Okay, it's not really a violation of the Constitution. The states have the right to segregate people. This is a right that the states have, as long as the Supreme Court says that they provide separate but equal accommodations. Then that's all fine. In other words, you have not been denied service. You were allowed to actually board the train, but you refused to seat in the proper section. But you were not denied service. In other words, you have a separate but equal, okay, facility, separate but equal accommodation. So as long as you're being provided some form of accommodation, you're being treated equally. That is to say, so segregation was considered to be now legal. In the United States in 1896. It's totally legal to do, okay, to segregate society, of course, okay. So Homer Plessy, of course, is not able to convince the Supreme Court that the states, the southern states, particularly the Jim Crow laws, were violating the 14th Amendment, by the way, as I mentioned. equal protection of the law. The Supreme Court of 1896 says, segregation is totally legal to do, in other words, okay? So, at any rate, now, what we're going to see here is that the Supreme Court now gives a green light, so to speak, for the states all over the country to segregate because it's now legal. You're not really violating the Constitution. Okay, so from 1896 onwards, segregation becomes now the norm in the United States in terms of, pretty much every public space and facility is going to be segregated. Schools, churches, parks, buses, beaches, trains, waiting rooms, restaurants, hotels, restrooms, drinking fountains, and other public accommodations. Again, so it across the board, okay? Even, again, drinking fountains, like water fountains and so on, that were segregated and so on. Again, so this is now, in other words, quote unquote, legal. Because of Plessy versus Ferguson, that pretty much opened the doors for the states to feel safe that, okay, so this is totally right to do, in other words. So this is another issue that the African American population is facing. Let me check the time. All right, so still have some time here. All right, so at any rate, so now let's look at the historical development again of the immediate, if you will, factors leading to the civil rights movement. And so really the civil rights movement, it all started as a push to desegregate. In other words, that minorities like African Americans, Mexican Americans, it all started that way. That what they wanted to do is end all of those Jim Crow laws, the segregation, if you will, so American society can become more integrated and everybody will be simply, treated equally before the law. Okay, before the law. The civil rights movement, for some historians, is considered to be the second Reconstruction. Okay, the second process of Reconstruction, because Reconstruction, remember, as I mentioned, was an attempt to rebuild American society to become a multiracial democracy. A great experiment that did not last very long. It ended in 1877 when the federal government said this is too much. Now the states will have to do pretty much provide civil liberties and rights to minorities and so on. So the federal government was now concerned with other things at that point, the economy and so on, but not civil rights. Okay. So Reconstruction, this building of a multiracial democracy, was an unfinished business, an unfinished reconstruction, because it was never fulfilled. In other words, because of all of the black codes and Jim Crow laws that we just mentioned that prevented African Americans and other minorities from voting, holding office, or having an equal, pretty much, access to facilities, if you will, because of segregation as well. Okay, so the civil rights movement is going to be the second Reconstruction era, so to speak, that is trying to bring about this multiracial democracy in the United States. Okay, so now what actually were the factors that actually push people to desegregate, to really create a multiracial democracy in which all peoples, regardless of race, color, ethnic background, national background, gender, etc., so they could all be treated equally before the law. Equal again, total equality. There were three causes for that. There were three factors that convinced people that the times had come to create this society based on equality. That is to say, and that all people, regardless of any background, religious background, gender, and so on, that doesn't matter. That if you're a citizen of the United States, you should enjoy the same liberties, rights, immunities, privileges that the Constitution provides, in other words. Okay? So, number one, we call, again, the three triggers of democratic change moving towards equality. The three triggers. What were the three triggers? Well, number one is the fact that in the opening decades of the 1900s, we're going to see a new philosophical trend in the United States. It's called the new liberalism. There were the new liberals, if you will, okay? There was a new liberal trend that was trying to redefine the concept of democracy. Because democracy and liberalism have always been pretty much, concepts that are interchangeable. If you were a Democrat, you were considered to be liberal, by the way. If you were liberal, you were considered to be a Democrat, almost, by default. But in the early 1900s, there were a group of people that called themselves the new liberals, because what they said is that, no, we're trying to redefine democracy because we feel and we know that the way we understand democracy, again, is very, very limited. Okay, so we are the new liberals that are going to redefine the meaning of democracy. Because in the past, okay, the liberals of the past that called themselves Democrats say they told themselves and others that they were Democrats because they defined democracy as simply as a philosophy that was based on the notion that individuals have rights by nature, called natural rights: life, liberty, and property. That was the definition of democracy. If you believe that individuals have certain rights that were given by nature, called life, liberty, and property, you believe in democracy. That's what a democratic society is. A democratic society is in which the rights of individuals are protected, of life, liberty, and property. That's what a democracy is. Okay, and if you believe in democracy, you're a liberal. Well, that's in the 19th century. Okay, but now in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, the new liberals are saying, well, wait a minute. Who has been the Democrats in the past? The Democrats in the 19th century were the slave owners, as a matter of fact. Okay, the Democratic Party, the stronghold, if you will, of the Democratic Party was in the South, in the slave-holding South, as a matter of fact. And why is it that the slave owners voted Democrat? Is because they believed that they had the right to own property, meaning slaves. Okay, life, liberty, and property. And since slaves were considered property, they said, well, I'm a Democrat. Nobody can take away my rights. I vote Democrat. I'm a liberal, in other words, because I believe, again, in the rights of owning slaves. So what the new liberals are saying, this cannot be the definition of democracy, because even slave owners call themselves Democrats, of course, back in the past. So what the new liberals are saying is that, no, the new definition, or the better definition of democracy, of this philosophy, this political philosophy called democracy, is a philosophy that actually says that all humans are created equal. Period. All humans, regardless of race, color, creed, gender, nationality, religion, we're all created equal. Okay? So if you have a system that actually treats everybody in that way equally, without any distinctions, then you have a democratic society. That's what a democratic society is. It's not just the protection of life, liberty, and property. That's very important. But if you don't treat people equally, then you're not truly democratic, in other words. That is the true, they say, definition of democracy. Okay? So they're, redefining totally democracy as equality. So we have, if we are to strive, if we're striving to become a truly democratic society, therefore, the reforms that we need is that we have to treat everybody equally. Everybody, okay, equally, okay. So, the new liberals are, of course, are looking at the 14th Amendment. It says even the 14th Amendment, passed back during Reconstruction, actually says equal protection of the law. So the spirit, again, of democracy is written there, okay, that all human beings are created equal. So therefore, the Constitution provides equal protection, okay, of the law to all people, okay, that are born in the United States. So again, this is the first trigger, so to speak, for democratic change, where people are saying is like, whoa, wait a minute. Okay, it's equality what we need here. Okay, equality. That is what is going to make us truly democratic. Okay, so the second, of course, trigger is the pressure of the Cold War. The fact is that by the 1950s and 60s, now the United States is involved in a competition again with the Soviet Union as to which of the two systems are going to provide a better living conditions, a kind of an earthly paradise. In other words, which of the two systems is it going to be capitalism and democracy, or is it going to be a communist state with a one-party rule and so on? Again, which of those two can provide a heaven on earth, for people to live happy? So there's a pressure that, well, we have to get better. We have to improve. We have to prove to the world that we are indeed the best possible system that has ever been created so far. Capitalist and democracy is the way to go, in other words. And because there's now television, there's media and so on, so it is easier to broadcast, news of what happens in one country like the United States, so the whole world can actually see. So, now the world can look at what happens here in the United States, how people live and so on. So it's not just a matter of what you say we are to the world, because people, can actually see for themselves, who you are. As a matter of fact, that goes for any nation, by the way, even the Soviet Union and all the other nations, of course. It's very easy. You just turn on the news and you can see what's going on in the news. You can find out, of course. So there's the pressure to improve. In other words, look, we need to really get better. In other words, we need to really become an example. In other words, we need to become an example, the leading example to the world. So we need to become more democratic. So what we need to do is end segregation, because segregation doesn't look very well here, in the United States. So there's a pressure, this international pressure, if you will, that we need to change for the better. Okay. And the third influence, or the third trigger for democratic change to move towards equality, was the influence of Mahatma Gandhi. He was the leader of the independence movement of India. Okay. In the 1940s, India was a British colony. It had been a British colony for about 300 years. And so in the 1930s and 40s, now India is moving towards independence, is led by Mahatma Gandhi. And the significance of this is that Gandhi was leading the independence of India through nonviolent means. In other words, he was not really mobilizing a force and trying to fight the British and so on. No, peaceful. In other words, a totally peaceful, non-violent protest. Not even breaking a window or anything. Not smashing anything. In other words, look, not fight back if you're being, beaten or whatever. Okay, because he believed that great change can come through peaceful means. And so the fact that he actually accomplished the independence of India, the only country that has gained independence through nonviolence in world history, is astonishing. Okay, so that was a great inspiration. Okay, Mahatma Gandhi will become like the great inspiration of the civil rights leaders of the 1950s and 60s in the United States. And so that, of course, those triggered those three issues: the neoliberalism, defining democracy as equality, the pressures of the Cold War, and the influence of Mahatma Gandhi triggered waves and waves of activism, starting with the African American community. The African Americans are the ones that are going to be the ones, the first ones, again, that are going to petition, pressure, in many ways, challenge, if you will, the predominant institutions, the white social control, so to speak, segregation, and trying to desegregate, okay, trying to integrate, the African American community with the rest of the national society. Because it was, of course, segregated. Of course, they're going to start with schools, the desegregation of schools. This is the first area that they start with. Segregation, again, was the norm. We talked about that. And they were considered to be totally lawful by the Supreme Court of 1896, because as long as they said, if you provide separate but equal, accommodations or facilities, then there's no problem. There's no violation, again, of the Constitution. But the fact is that segregated schools were, in fact, very unequal, okay, in every possible way. They received less financial resources, for example, okay? They received less funding. That's what it means, okay? Whether they were the black schools or the Mexican-American schools and so on. In terms of the number and quality of teachers as well, okay? They had less teachers than the other schools, of course, and the quality of schools as well. It was still much, superior, if you will, higher quality in the white schools and in the black schools as well. So that was very, very evident as well. And of course, segregated schools were very well known for affecting the self-esteem, of students, because if you go to a segregated school that has less funding, that the quality of teacher is very, very limited, just to put it in that way. So this is going to affect the way you're going to see education. Well, you're not being educated, okay? So you're going to think, well, so why am I here? Okay? What can I actually do with education? What kind of jobs await for me, after school? So again, this was affecting, the self-esteem of students, in which, of course, was reflected in the results. For example, the failing exams, dropout rates, and so on. That was, of course, something pervasive in the segregated schools. So it was unequal. There was unequal amount of attention, resources, funding given to the segregated schools. So therefore, the results were also unequal, less graduates and people dropping out and so on and so forth. Again, you can see that the results, speak for themselves as well. Okay. So, again, this led to some individuals to challenge, of course, segregation. Like Oliver Brown, he wanted to send his daughter to the best possible school. It was nearby. It was about a mile away from his own house. But by the law of Kansas, the state law, he needed to send his daughter to the segregated school about 10 miles away. Okay? So by law. So he said, why am I going to send my daughter 10 miles away when I can actually send her here, just a mile away? But again, so he tried to enroll her, the daughter, in this nearby school, and the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas denied enrollment because, segregation. So Mr. Brown sued the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and this case reached all the way to the Supreme Court in 1954. So in 1954, again, the Supreme Court receives a very similar case that it received back in 1896 with Homer Plessy versus Ferguson. I'm sorry. Okay. Segregation. What Mr. Brown was actually challenging segregation. Like, look, segregation is unlawful. It's unconstitutional. Kansas, the state of Kansas and the Board of Education is violating the 14th Amendment. What about equality? I thought we were all citizens in the United States. We should be treated equally and so on. Why segregation? In other words, this goes against the 14th Amendment. That was his whole argument. But now the court of 1954, the Warren Court, okay, is going to actually side with Mr. Brown, okay, in saying it is true. Segregation is totally unconstitutional. Okay, segregation is unconstitutional. So it reversed the ruling of the Supreme Court decision of 1896. This court is reversing that and saying, no, segregation is not legal to do. Okay, it's actually very unconstitutional. And so the Supreme Court actually declared separate but equal and all segregation to be unconstitutional in the United States and began to order the desegregation of schools. something that did not actually happen overnight. It took, of course, quite a while. Second, the desegregation of city buses. Okay, city buses were also segregated in many places across the South. And in Montgomery, Alabama, there was a lady by the name of Rosa Parks that actually challenged the segregation of the city buses when she sat in the quote unquote wrong side, if you will, of the aisle. And so she was told by the bus driver to give up the seat. And she refused to give up the seat that she has been, that she sat in the wrong section and so on. So she pretty much challenged, of course, the bus driver and the law. And she actually was arrested, by the way. Okay, there was a whole scandal. The bus driver actually stopped the bus. She was actually arrested. So that led to a boycott movement, again, in Montgomery, Alabama. And the leader of the boycott movement was actually Martin Luther King Jr. Okay. Martin Luther King Jr. was actually the leader of the boycott movement that told people, we're not going to use, that company, where nobody is going to actually board any of those city buses from now on until the city buses desegregate. That's exactly what a boycott movement. In other words, we're not going to, buy that service, in other words, from that company until it desegregates. So this is the early origins of Martin Luther King Jr. He actually had a religious background. He was like a Baptist minister who was very gifted in terms of, he was very articulate. He was very charismatic. He could communicate messages very effectively as well. And he was very much inspired by Mahatma Gandhi in that he was actually telling people to protest in a very peaceful, nonviolent way as well. Okay. He's going to be the national voice, as a matter of fact, of the civil rights movement because he promoted the idea of nonviolence. That since he said India accomplished its independence through nonviolence, we can actually accomplish the same thing here. We can desegregate, not only city buses but also all other facilities, all other spaces, all society can be desegregated altogether, through nonviolence as well. Okay, so segregation in buses, of course, were now believed by the boycott movement to be unconstitutional, and the courts are going to actually side, okay, with the movement and declare, of course, all segregation in buses also unconstitutional as well. Okay, so Martin Luther, of course, is rising to prominence, to national prominence now. Okay, this is the early rise of Martin Luther King Jr., and he's now seen, of course, as the spokesperson, not only for the African American community, but for all the other minorities as well, for women, for Mexican Americans, for literally, again, every minority that had not enjoyed, okay, the equal protection of the law, is going to now see in Martin Luther a leader, so to speak, of course, because he was, in a certain sense, pretty much advocating for this multiracial democracy, the same way that the radical Republicans of Reconstruction, again, during Reconstruction, that they were also trying to create this multiracial democracy. The only difference is that Martin Luther King was an African American, that he's now the one that is actually leading this national movement for, integration and a multiracial democracy. So again, in this part, again, we're going to look now at civil rights legislation. Okay, very quickly, we're not going to take more than just a few minutes, but just the legislation itself, not that we understood pretty much the development, the background. Now let's look at what kind of legislation was passed now that groups are becoming more and more active, trying to now desegregate American society, but also provide equal opportunities, equal protection of the law, equal rights to vote, equal pay, and so on. Equality. Again, equality is really the essence of the civil rights movement. Equality. Okay, so legislation. What kind of legislation is now going to emanate? Those are the actual pieces of legislation that attempted to bring about reform. Okay, so here we're going to see that the federal government is once again going to be very much now involved in trying to establish this multiracial democracy. Okay, so it's going to step in and try to bring about certain changes. So, for example, in the Eisenhower presidency, when Eisenhower was president in the 1950s, the first civil rights legislation was launched again during his presidency. That came with the Brown versus Topeka decision. Okay, when Mr. Brown sued the Board of Education at Topeka, the Supreme Court, ordered the desegregation of schools. So this is the beginning stage, again, of the civil rights legislation. The Supreme Court says all schools that are federal and public, they have to desegregate from this point onwards. Okay, that's the beginning of that. And in 1960, just before he left office, Eisenhower also, through this presidency, passed the Voting Rights Act of 1960 that begins removing barriers to black voting as well. This is the beginning stages to start removing some of the barriers to the black vote as well. Now, during the Kennedy presidency, we're going to see a piece of legislation during his presidency that aimed to provide equality between men and women in terms of equal pay. Okay, the Equal Pay Act, forbidding employers paying different wages for equal work based on sex, in other words. Okay, so this is a great accomplishment, at least, a piece of legislation that is now prohibiting employers from paying less wages, less salaries, for equal work based on sex. Okay, very important. Another piece of legislation. So during the Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, presidency, okay, we're going to see the two pieces of legislation, okay, that are going to be extremely important here. One is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, okay? This is perhaps the heart and soul of the civil rights movement, if you will, the legislation, that is to say. It's called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that ended segregation in all public facilities. In other words, the Civil Rights Act says segregation is illegal everywhere in the United States, okay, in all public facilities, that is to say, public facilities. It forbade employers to discriminate on the basis of race, religion, sex, and national origin as well. And it's called the Civil Rights Act. So it marked the end of segregation, at least, again, in the legal statutes, if you will. Again, it's totally illegal to desegregate. Title VII guarantees women legal protection against discrimination as well, okay, under the Civil Rights Act as well, okay. Another change is the 24th Amendment that banned poll taxes for voting, okay. No more people have to pay. This idea that you have to pay to vote, like a poll tax, again, is also, again, under the 24th Amendment. That's banned once and for all. That prohibited people with less money, or, that were economically deprived, again, from voting. In many cases, minorities, of course. The Voting Rights Act. This is another, really, highlight of the civil rights legislation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed literacy tests and other voting restrictions, okay, like the literacy test or the poll taxes, the grandfather clauses, and all that. All those black codes, as they were called, they were outlawed here, and they were granted federal supervision of elections in black districts as well by the Voting Rights Act as well, okay. And the Great Society legislation by ALBJ, it created, of course, Medicaid in 1965, which was healthcare for the poor, and Medicare. Okay, Medicare was in 1965 healthcare for the elderly and the disabled. Very important. So the legislation is really moving beyond just simply trying to create, equal opportunities for voting and, having equal pay, but also addressing the issue again of healthcare. That people cannot afford it. For example, Medicaid and Medicare as well. Okay, and also the Nixon presidency. President Nixon also during his presidency, we're going to see two pieces of legislation as well. The Philadelphia Plan of 1969, it's called affirmative action again, that actually kind of what it did is that all agencies, institutions that received federal funding, okay, had to contract minorities. So if any industry or any agency, institution that received funding, okay, grants from the federal government, now they needed to hire a certain quota, a certain percentage of minorities, okay, African Americans, Mexican Americans, women, and so on. They needed to have a certain percentage in the workforce, by law. It's called affirmative action, in other words, or the Philadelphia Plan. And finally, again, is the Environmental Protection Agency of 1970. This is another civil rights, legislation that addressed the issue of the environment. People were very concerned with pollution, for example. And the EPA, as it was called, was now a governmental agency that was there to regulate industries, trying to control pollution and protect the environment as well. Part of the civil rights movement was also the environment. Okay, it was not just, minorities, but also the environment. Of course, there's also this issue of the environment in the EPA. Okay, so with that, we conclude our topic again on the civil rights movement. This is the end of it. We have now concluded 9 topics fully. This is the end of the semester. This is the end, again, of this class. This is all I have for you. So this is, again, now, we conclude now a long semester that started out, back in the process of building modern America, when the United States was built, as a modern industrial economy, modern industrial society, going all the way to the end of the 20th century, the Cold War, and we're looking at also at the end here, this last popular reform movement, okay? The countercultural revolution and the civil rights movement. Okay, so this is the end of this class. This is all I have for you for this class. Thank you for your attention. And perhaps I'll see you in another course in the future. Thank you.